Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Unreal Engine tutorials. In this tutorial we're going to cover how to create a Unreal Motion graphic menu that resides in 3D space in your game world. So we have a very simple level here, and in this level we have a switch and a door. So this door, we can run up to it, we can't go through it. But if we run up to the switch, the door will open. And if we step away from the switch, the door closes. So this is really just to have a starting point to say that we have a working door and a working switch. But we want to upgrade this switch so that it actually has something that the player can interact with. We're going to create an Unreal Motion graphic that we're going to have set right above this button, so that when we walk up to it, this button will appear in 3D space, appear to float in midair, and we can interact with it to open and close this door. So the very first thing we need to do is actually create the motion graphic that we want to use. So if we go into our root content folder, and we'll go ahead and make a new folder, and we'll just call this UMG. And UMG stands for Unreal Motion Graphics. This is the menu system that is in Unreal Engine 4 that you can create menus with text fields and buttons and really complex layouts. So we're actually going to create a really simple one today with just a single button, and we can just right click in our content browser and go down all the way down to user interface, and inside there all the way down again to the bottom says widget blueprint, and we will go ahead and just call this UMG door button. It's a really simple name. We'll go ahead and open that up. Now normally when we're creating a user interface in UMG, we would use this large blue, well, it turns blue when you mouse over it. We use this large box. So inside this blue box is where we'd lay out our user interface, and we could have lots of different things that you can do in UMG. Maybe I'll do a tutorial on it in the future. But what we're going to do is actually just use this canvas panel as a way to house the assets that we want to use. So we're going to use just a single button for this tutorial. But you can do things quite a lot more complicated. So we're going to grab a button, drag it onto our canvas panel, and with the button selected, the first thing we're going to do is actually name this button. We don't want it called button 0. And that's because when we later we're going to make a binding, which is a way to control the behavior of a certain aspect of your user interface object in UMG. And if we make several bindings of, let's say, a button click, we would have button 0 click, button 1 click, button 2 click, and that really has no meaning. So let's go ahead and rename this to be our door button. And once we created our door button, the first thing we want to do is set our anchor point. And anchors is a way to have our UI stick to a certain corner or edge of the screen. So we're going to stick it toward the bottom, in the middle. And we're actually going to, I'm going to call out very specific measurements. And these measurements I figured out beforehand. But one thing you'll notice when we make our size, we're only going to make this button 128 wide and 48 tall. Now that sounds really small. You can see it's quite a small button. And our X and Y position, X is going to be -64, which is half of our width, and our Y position is going to be -48, which is our entire height. So what this does, if we scroll a mouse wheel here, we can zoom in. This gives us a nice small button here. Now this looks really tiny, and it would be if this UMG was being used in what's called screen space, which means it's going to be displayed on top of the game in a standard UI. But we're going to put this inside a 3D world, so you need your UI to be much smaller than you're probably used to designing when you go to put it in 3D space. This is especially important in VR when a lot of things feel a lot closer to your face than they would normally. So there is our button. And let's go ahead and actually just really quickly add some color to this. Let's set our color and opacity. We'll set G and B to both 0, so we get a red color here. Our background color, we'll go ahead and make that red as well. Just have a nice red button, and mainly doing a red button because our pedestal has a red button, just so they match. Now let's also grab some text out of our palette and drag that onto the button. And this text, we actually want this text to be white. So actually we want our color and opacity to actually be white. So we need to leave that all at white. So the color and opacity gives you the front or a tint of the entire thing, and the background color just colors the background of the button. So we're going to have the text, let's just have it, first of all, be centered. And then we can set it to say, let's just have it say use door, because we're going to be both opening and closing our door. So we'll just have it as use door. Now, obviously we're cutting off part of our text. It says use do right now. So to fix that, a couple things we need to do. First, we need to pick a different font. And that's because of how small this is as far as UMG is concerned. The text can look a little pixelated. It's usually best actually to make a special texture for this, but we're just going to use the built-in fonts. So when we go to pick a new font, we won't see a font by default here, and that's because we're using one of the engine fonts called Roboto. We want to go find one called Roboto Tiny. So if we go to View Options and say Show Engine Content, once we check Show Engine Content, then we'll actually be able to see all of these other fonts. There's 3 of them: Droid Sans Mono, Roboto Tiny, and Roboto. We're going to use Roboto Tiny just so it's a lot thinner, and we're actually going to set the text size to 20. That makes it a nice small amount so that we have a nice bit of text here in the middle. Now once we've set all of that, we now need to actually bind this button to do something when it's clicked. And before we do that, one last thing, and I usually forget to do this, so it's a good thing to point out. This text, we need to actually set its visibility. So I actually want to change this to hit test invisible. The reason we want to set this at hit test invisible is that we don't want this text to interfere with the user's ability or the player's ability to actually click or interact with the button. If we left it at visible, then the only place that you could click on the button would be this border around where the text is. Because if you try to go click on the text, then UMG will think you're clicking on the text and not the button. So it's an easy thing to forget to do, and then your UI will not be responding like you want it to. So I just wanted to go ahead and point that out. It's important to do that. Now that we have the button set up, we need to actually do something. So let's highlight our button in our hierarchy panel, and we're going to scroll down to the bottom where we have all of our events. The first one is the one we want, the OnClicked Events. When we click that, we're going to jump over to our graph in UMG, and we get this nice OnClicked, and see how it says door button in parentheses? Door button is the name that we typed out. So if we hadn't typed a name, this would have said OnClicked door. Instead of OnClicked door button, it would have said OnClicked button 0. So now this is a more descriptive name. So the first thing we want to do is we actually want to create a variable, and we're going to call this BP door. So this is going to be a variable for our blueprint that is already in this project for our door, because we want to, when this button is clicked, send the door a message to tell it to open or close. So in order to do that, we need the variable type for this variable to actually be a BP door, and we want it to be a reference. Now we're going to take this reference, and the first thing we want to do with it before we start using it is we want to make it public or visible. So what we want to do is make it so that we can use this from outside of this UMG, and we'll show how to set that up in a minute. So now that we've made this visible, we need to drag this in and get it. So we have get our reference, and we're actually going to use a really neat node called flip-flop. And what this does is every time you pass through this flip-flop node, it will flip-flop or change back and forth between an A and a B output, and it will use this is A. If it is A is true, it's going out of A. If is B is false, it's going out of B. So it's a really good way to have different execution paths in Blueprint executed one after the other depending on which time you've done it. So it's kind of like a light switch. You can think of it that way. So it also works really well for opening and closing our door. So we're going to take our reference to our BP door, and we're going to search for use, and we get our function use door. So this is already built in to this door blueprint that we created. And actually, if you are a patron of mine, you'll have access to this project through the patron-only posts on my Patreon page. So you'll be able to check out how I created this door. So we're actually going to put both A and B into use door, and then use is A to say if we want the door open or closed. So what this is going to do, it looks a little odd to do it this way, but what this will do is that the first time this button is pressed, it's going to go to A. Is A will be true, which means we want to open the door. Then the next time we do this, then it'll go through B, and is A will be false, which means if we don't want to open the door, we want to close it, so it'll close. So this will allow us to basically keep clicking this button, and it'll just open and close the door repeatedly. So if we click compile and save, that's actually it for our UMG. This is really simple setup here. Now we need to add this to our game world. So what we're going to do is go back into our content browser, and inside our blueprints folder, we have their BP switch. So we open this up. This is our switch that currently is telling our door to open and close when we approach the switch and we walk away from it. So generally how this works is we have two events here that are checking if the player is overlapping with our overlap sphere. So if we look at our viewport, we have this overlap sphere. So when the player walks into it, what we're doing is just telling the door to open, and when they walk away, we're telling it to close. Now, we don't want this door opening and closing functionality in this switch anymore, because it's inside of the UMG that we just made. So we want to actually highlight these and delete them, because we don't need to call that from here anymore. What we're actually going to do instead is we're going to tell our have our user interface tell the door to open and close. And then what we're going to use on these overlap events is we're going to show and hide our user interface. So let's first set up showing and hiding our user interface. So what we need to do is go to add component, and we need to scroll down and find our widget component. Now, one thing to note, this is in the experimental section. Experimental means these are features that are in the engine, you can use them, they work, but they may and probably will change at some future release. Which means if you use them in 4.13, which is what I'm using now, there's no guarantee that in 4.14 version of Unreal Engine that these will work in the same way, or they could even be removed from the engine. So it's just a thing to keep in mind when using these experimental features. So we're going to add a widget. We will call this our door button widget. Now what a widget is this is a component that allows you to have a UMG user interface displayed in a 3D game world. So if we go to our viewport, our widget's down at basically at the floor here. So we kind of actually want to drag this up so that our button will actually end up above this pedestal. So I actually have exact numbers here, so I'm going to go ahead and type those in. So I want the X to be 0, the Y to be 6, and our Z to be 139. So that gets us right here at the top of our pedestal. Now we have a couple other settings we need to adjust. The first thing is we have this engine materials widget 3D pass through mask one-sided. So this is the material that is being used to render the widget, and you'll see that it says a widget 3D pass through masked. So that means that you won't actually get any transparency to your user interface. So if you wanted to have some transparency, which we didn't actually add in, if you wanted to do that really quick, if we pop back into our UMG door button and our designer tab, if we wanted to on our button actually modify the alpha to be, let's say, 0.8, so that way there's a little bit of transparency on the button. So you can see it's a little darker over red, but it's got a little bit of transparency. Go ahead and save and compile the button. Here, if we wanted some transparency to our user interface, to maybe make it look like a hologram, we'd have to actually change this widget 3D pass-through masked one-sided from being the masked material to actually being the translucent material, which is here. And we want to go ahead and do translucent one-sided. I like doing that, especially if we're trying to almost mimic a hologram that you could only see it from one side. So we'll go ahead and change that. Now what we need to do next is go into the user interface section, and we're going to adjust a couple of these settings. So the first thing is the widget class. So we need to find our button UMG. So if we just search for button, it should come up right. It should come right up. There's a UMG door button. So what this does is, you see now we have this large UI piece right here. So this is actually our user interface, and you can see that we can see our use door button. Now we don't actually need to draw all of this user interface, and also it's not rotated the correct direction. So let's fix those two things. So the first thing is, let's go ahead and actually rotate our user interface. Rotate this 90 degrees. So that's the first thing we want to do. So now that it's rotated 90 degrees, it's going to show up correctly as far as facing. Now if you'll notice, if I go here, it disappears. And that's fine. That's the effect we want. Now, and you'll also notice it's way down here underneath. So we can actually change that by adjusting the pivot and adjusting the Y pivot value to be 1. So what this means is now it is actually where our widget component is in terms of 3D space. So that makes it a little easier to adjust where this UI is going to show up. The other thing is, like I said, we don't need this to be this tall. In fact, we don't want all of this extra translucency drawn. So what we're going to do is, instead of this being 500 by 500, let's actually scale this down a little bit. Let me check my settings here. We can actually scale it down to be the size of our button, really, because we're only displaying the one button. So that would be 128 wide and 64 tall. So you can see it'll be a little bigger than our button, which is fine. So that way we're just displaying this particular button. Now the other thing we actually don't want to do in this case is we actually don't want this to be window focusable, at least not at this point, because we're not really doing this as a whole piece of UI that someone will basically be standing in front of and interacting with a long time. It's just going to be a single button that's going to show up. Now also, this button is a little big, even at the small size we made it in UMG. So what we can actually do is we can actually directly modify the scale of the widget component. So we can actually make this about 0.5 the size that it was, half the size of before. So that actually looks nice. I kind of like that size. And you can play around with this and kind of find out what you want it to look like. And you can see if you get a little close, it does get a little pixelated. So really, if you want to even make it smaller than that, like 0.3, something like that, that looks pretty good. So, but you can adjust the size as you see fit. So now we can actually go play this. We'll just do play a new window. And now you can see that we have a little button above our door. Now we probably don't want that button available to see all the time, so we can adjust that. Now you could think that, well, I can just go ahead and click on this, but nothing happens. And that's because we haven't done the whole picture yet, right? We've got the UMG created, we've got it displaying in the level. We haven't actually made the character able to interact with it yet. So that's what's next, is to get it to be interactable. And we kind of want this to appear and disappear. I think that would be pretty cool. So let's adjust this to make it appear when we walk up to the pedestal and disappear when we walk away, because we already have those overlap events that we had earlier, right? The begin and end overlap. So what we're actually going to do is a pretty simple thing. We're going to take this widget, we're going to change its visibility setting to be false, which means that now it's not visible anymore. And then what we're going to do is we are going to take this widget, drag it in to get a reference to it, and we're just going to say toggle visibility. And we're going to, when we overlap, begin and end overlap, we're just going to toggle the visibility. So what this means is now it won't be in the game world, and when I walk up, it'll appear. And when I walk away, it disappears. And you can actually do a lot of other things with this. You can do, you could take this widget and move it around, spin it in and out, do numerous different things to kind of make your UI a little more dynamic. I'll leave that to something you can toy around with yourself. Now, like I said earlier, we can't actually interact with this button yet, and that's because we need to actually use another kind of component called a Widget Interaction Component. So to do that, we need to actually go into our player character blueprint. So if you open up our character blueprint, I have a single input action use. So this is an input action event. It's been set up as an action event inside of the bindings, or the input bindings for the engine. So what we're going to do is actually pretty straightforward. We need to add a new component to our character, because having a widgets in 3D space has two sides of it. We have actually displaying it with the widget component is one side, and then the other side is doing the interaction with the widget interaction component. Now the widget interaction component is new as of Unreal Engine 4.13. It's under the experimental section. And this even says in its description, this is a highly experimental component. So what this does is it allows you to interact with widget components in 3D game space. It does this by taking a line trace from a predetermined start point to an end point, and it calculates the end point for you. And then along that line trace, if it interacts with or comes across any UI, then you can actually start sending commands through to the user interface. So this particular component does have a location in 3D space. You can see it has this very large red arrow here. So there's a couple different ways you can have these interaction components, this widget interaction component work. So we'll go look at the settings for that. So the important thing to look for is this interaction source. So we can say world source, which means it'll actually be where this component is located in 3D space. So for example, if you're doing a VR game with a motion controller, you could attach the interaction widget to your motion controller, and then it's from wherever your motion controller is in 3D space that you are trying to then interact with a piece of UI. You could also have it go by the mouse. So if you have a game that has mouse control, maybe an RTS game or something like that, you could have the interaction come from where the mouse cursor is. You can also do screen center or center screen, that's what we're going to do. And we're doing that because if you look at when we play our game, our reticle on screen is at the center of the screen. So in order to avoid any complicated code about moving the interaction widget around to match the camera, we're just going to go from the center of the screen. There's also a custom setting. So if you do custom, then you can actually do custom starting points for where your widget interaction should begin from. And it's not from the component, it'll be from some other place in 3D space, and you have to actually do the calculation or request the calculation be done on certain parameters. So we're going to use center screen, and we're actually going to leave all the other settings the same. So the interaction distance you can adjust, that. We'll leave it at 500, and that's fine for us. We can leave this at the middle of our character because again we're going from screen center and not from where the component is. So let's get this set up. So if we go back to our event graph and in our input action use, what we need to do is get a reference to our widget interaction component. And the first thing we need to do is we need to actually check if the widget interaction is actually able to interact or is over something it can interact with. So we can have a branching point of, are we interacting with some UI or are we going to be doing something else? So all of the commands for this interaction component are inside of this interaction section here. So there's some events that you can actually do some event binding versus some more advanced stuff that you can do with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to get is over interactable widget. So that means, are we actually looking at something that we can interact with? So we're going to then get a branch off of here. So whenever we press the use button, which in this game is our left mouse button, whenever you press that, if this is true, that we're over an interactable widget, then we need to actually simulate sending a key press. So how we do that is with a particular function call to the widget interaction component. So we grab another reference to it, just so we don't have wires running all over the place. And from here, we're going to send a press pointer key. We'll press this function. So a pointer key, what this is doing is basically simulating as if your interaction is coming from the pointer or the mouse cursor. And we're going to use the key of key mouse left mouse button. We'll drag that from true. So what this is doing is, if we have pressed our button, then we're going to check if we're over an interactable object. If we are, or an interactable widget rather, then we're going to send this press pointer key. Now, the other thing we can do is, if we release, we need to actually send a release command, because how buttons work is you press them for one state, for a press state, you release, and that initiates a click. So we need to release pointer key. And it gave me handily gave me a widget interaction reference here, and we want the key to be mouse left mouse button. And that's actually it. Really straightforward. So we're going to save and compile this. And now when we play, if we run up to our pedestal, we'll see we now have a button. And you'll see it's pretty subtle, but if I mouse over and come back, you can see the button is actually changing its state. It's highlighting. And when I left click, oop, nothing's happening. Why is nothing happening? Well, you see, we got an error reported while playing in editor. That's because we set up our button, but we haven't told our button who our door is, right? Because if you remember, we set up this use door function, and we're using this BP door variable, but we haven't set up this variable yet. So let's show you how to do that. So if we go back to our first-person character, this is the point where it kind of starts to break down. We send this pointer key, it's then received by our button, and our button is like, oh, I don't know what this door is. So how do we tell the widget what the door is? Okay, so let's get this set up. So how we tell the widget where the door is, we need to actually be able to tell this widget before we ever get to the point of the player being able to click on this button. And where we do that is inside of our BP switch. So what we need to do is, we need to actually add an event begin play. So this happens right when our game starts. And what we're going to do is, we're going to say, go grab our door button widget component, and we're going to then ask it for its widget. So it's going to say get user widget object. So what this does is it asks our widget component for the widget object that is in the 3D space. So it's going to actually ask for, okay, what widget are you using? I need a reference to it. Then we're going to cast this to our UMG door button, because what this does is gives us just a generic widget object, and we need to actually have reference to our own instance of it, which is a UMG door button. Go ahead and hook that up to event begin play. And the reason we're doing that is we need to set our BP door variable inside of our widget. So this is getting our widget, casting it to our door button so we get access to its BP door variable. Now, what is this variable going to be set to exactly? Well, it's going to be set to a reference I've already prepared for us, a door blueprint reference. So we pull this out and get it, and I can dump it right in here. Now this door blueprint reference, where this comes from is pretty simple. I have a variable here called door blueprint. It is publicly editable, and it is of a type BP door. Now the cool thing is, when you're placing stuff in the editor, if you have a variable that is public on an object that's placed in a scene, so we have our switch here placed in the scene, if we go and look, we have this door blueprint variable in our default section. If I click on this, it now pulls up a menu to select an actor to place in this, because the engine knows, hey, this is a blueprint, it's of a particular type, and now it's going to show me, okay, in my UMG 3D menu example map, it's going to show me all the lists of every single BP door. In this case, this is BP door 400 is the name the engine has assigned, and I can just click on that. And that will set up my reference. So that sets up my reference to this particular door. If I happen to have another door, like if I held Option or Alt and picked another door, if I had another door, I could actually go back to this switch, click on this again, and I'll have two doors, BP door and BP door 2, right? So this BP door 400 and BP door 2. So I could even change it if I wanted to. I'm going to change that back to our first door and delete this second door because we don't need it anymore. But that's how you would set up that reference. So that reference I already set up. That's an extra little tidbit of information about how to set up in-map references. But now that that reference is set up inside of our switch, when the game actually starts playing, we'll go ahead and actually tell our widget object what door it's going to be interacting with. So I click compile, now I can play, and now we have all the pieces. We walk up to our switch, this UI appears. We can mouse over it because we have the widget interaction component, and now when I click on it, my door opens. Click on it again, and the door closes. And when I step away, the button disappears. And that's it. That is creating a UMG widget, adding it into our game world, being able to now interact with it and affect something in the world with the interaction. This video was supported by patrons on my Patreon page. If you're a patron, thank you so much for your support. If you'd like to support me making more videos like this one, check out the videos on the left, subscribe to my YouTube channel below, and become a patron by clicking on that big orange Become a Patron button. See you next time!